I was 16 years old. I was riding my horse bareback out at the ranch where we boarded her in Iowa. We lived in Iowa. My sisters were there. I had at the time um, one sister was 14 and she was in the car because she's allergic to horses with the windows rolled up, and the other sister, my little sister, was 11. And I had taken my horse out by myself because my friend couldn't ride with me that day. She was sick. So I had been out riding the end of April. I had just gotten my license a few weeks before. And after about an hour or so, I decided to come back to the barn because I figured my sisters were getting bored. So I headed back to the barn, and above the barn was what we called the Ridge Trail. It was a trail along a hill that overlooked the barn, overlooked the valley on the far side of the barn, overlooked the valley in front of the barn. And I rode to the end of the Ridge Trail. It was a dead end. There was no way to get off other than to go back and go down to the barn. And I was just sitting there enjoying the view when I heard hoofbeats behind me. And I knew exactly who it was. It was a man on an out of control Arabian. Um, and he was coming pretty fast. So I just stayed on my horse because most horses, when they're running out of control, will run back to the barn. And I assumed the horse would do that. But instead, the horse, with the man flapping wildly and crazily on his back, came down the ridge trail. And I kind of froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should jump off my horse because I was afraid I would be trampled if there was an interaction between the two horses. I thought, okay, once this horse sees my horse standing calmly, he will stop. But he didn't. And he ran into my horse. My horse reared up. At the first time she reared, I dropped the reins and just grabbed her neck. The second time she reared up, she stepped backwards off the ridge trail and flipped over upside down onto me. So we flipped off the trail down the slope. She rolled across my body. And as she hit my chest, I knew I was dead. Every cell in my body stood stock still, and I knew I was dead, and I instantly left my body. And I was 30, 40 feet up in the air, watching. I saw my horse, roll over my body, and my body was tossed like a rag doll. I didn't care. My body meant nothing to me. I knew it was me immediately. I knew that was me, but I didn't care. I saw my horse right herself and slide down the slope and head to the barn. I saw my middle sister put her hands against the car window with a look of horror on her face. I saw my little sister scream and cover her face with her hands. I saw the man on the Arabian run. The Arabian turned and ran down the other trail towards the barn. I saw a lot of commotion in the barn, which was odd because the barn faced away from me, but I could see into the barn. And the only thing I had one thought in my head at that moment, one thought, and that was, I wish my sisters didn't have to see me die. That was the only thought I had. I did not care that I was dead. And at that moment, I noticed there was a light over my shoulder, over my right shoulder. And as I had that thought, I saw that the light was illuminating everything before me. And suddenly I realized it was a light, but it was a man. The light was emanating from this man. And he moved forward until he was beside me. I looked at him and I recognized him immediately. It was as if I said, "Hi, how are you?" I knew him. I had always known him. I'd known him since I was a small child. It was Jesus, which didn't strike me as being odd at all at that moment. It should have been odd because my father is an atheist, my mother's an agnostic, and even though we were part of an Orthodox community, my father told us on an almost daily basis, and I am sorry if I offend anyone, that Jesus Christ is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind, and Christianity was a hoax, and Christians were stupid for having hope because my father believes that there is no heaven, there is no hell, there's no God. When you die, you're buried and forgotten. You are no more significant than the tiniest speck of dust in this infinite universe. So Jesus is the last person I should have encountered, and he was the first person, and he was the first person I encountered.
So to speak, say anything to you, or what was what were you feeling or sensing in that first part of your journey?
We were talking. We spoke the entire time we were together. I can't tell you everything we said now, because even though when I was dead, I knew everything that was going on, and what I realized was all my questions were answered. Um, all those existential questions, all those nagging questions. Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Is there a God? Is there heaven? It was all answered. I had no more questions. And Jesus and I had all the time in the world, because time was immaterial. Time simply wasn't a factor, but we communicated. Did my lips move? I do not know that my lips moved, but we could still communicate. It was heart to heart. It was mind to mind. We communicated about my life. We communicated about pretty much everything. And the thing is, I had known him since I was a little kid. I had always believed in God despite my parents. And I realized that he was the one I had been talking to my entire life when I prayed at night. And I would have conversations with God every night. That was him. He'd been by my bedside. And I always had a tangible feeling that he was there, because I just turned to him and I said, I know you. And he started to laugh. So he didn't say, and he didn't, there was no chest thumping. I am Jesus, believe in me. I always say that. People think, did he come at you with fire and brimstone? Did he announce himself? No. I simply knew who he was. There was no doubt in my mind. There was no question. He was Jesus. And he had always been with me. He was my best friend, my father, my brother, everything. He was everything to me in that moment. This is the best way I can describe it. It's like flying with Superman. He was so fun. He's fun. He's funny. We laughed the whole time. He took my hand and we left the barn area. I had a life review actually in the barn area, but we left. I'm going to be honest with you. Where we went, I was so busy looking at his face that it was kind of hard for me to attend to what was happening behind him. So what I saw passing was, as I looked at his face, I could see things passing behind him. It seemed as if we were on Earth, we were passing things on Earth. I could see individual things. And we were basically surfing on a wave of light. I looked down and I could see both of our feet, and underneath our feet, our bare feet, was this rolling wave of light. So it was like body surfing, and the light was all colors. And it tickled the bottoms of my feet, and we were going faster and faster and faster. And I saw ahead briefly. It was a barrier, and I cannot explain the barrier, but it was as if we crossed a threshold. Think of it as a door. You're stepping through a threshold or stepping over a threshold. It was as if we crossed a threshold. And at that point, I couldn't differentiate. I couldn't see individual things at that point. All things became one thing, and that one thing was God. Now, I was still an individual. He was still an individual, but I saw that all of those things were God. And it was after we crossed the threshold, this particular threshold, that we came into a light.
Most of the folks that we've interviewed, they had their afterlife experience when they were well into adulthood. And obviously you're having this experience when you were 16. So in terms of your life review, what does that look like for a 16-year-old? I'm kind of curious.
Well, I was a pretty good kid. I was having some issues at that time. I had experienced a great deal of abuse in my 16 years. And at that point, I was kind of fighting back, rebelling. I was using some drugs. I was hanging out with some kids I probably shouldn't have been hanging out with. And when I had my life review, Jesus didn't focus on that. He didn't say, I didn't get any lectures. I didn't get finger pointing. I didn't get, don't use drugs. I didn't get, don't hang out with those kids. What I got was a review, and it was actually pretty short because, as I said, I was a good kid. I was nice to people. Even if I was hurting myself, I was still pretty nice to people. And what he showed me, and he showed it to me because I was judging myself. Jesus was there pointing things out. He was there saying, well, why don't we look at this? Why don't we consider this? What do you think about that? But he wasn't judging me. I was judging me. And the one thing I saw and felt was if I hurt someone, if my words hurt someone, I felt what they felt. I understood the impact my words and actions had on other people. And it changed me. I am very not perfect, believe me. I can cuss with the best of them, and I can yell at my kids, I can yell at my husband, I get mad, but it changed me in that I'm aware of what I do. I'm aware of how my actions impact others, and I pay attention to myself.
A lot of people, Heidi, talk about, or they want to know what Jesus looks like.
Well, I actually had a pretty good Orthodox education because our synagogue was Orthodox, even though my parents didn't believe. We went to the synagogue and spent a lot of time there. Jesus is perfect. He's perfection. He's well, Randy, you've probably experienced this, but his hair's about my length. It's a chestnut brown. He's got some streaks in it. It's wavy. He has a lean face with kind of scruff, beard and mustache, but not too long. He has beautiful mouth, a gorgeous smile. You can't look away from his smile. It's infectious. His eyes radiate all the joy in the universe, and this was really hard for me to tell anyone at first, they are blue. They are the most beautiful blue eyes I've ever seen. And I didn't want to say anything about that because even though people in my family have hazel eyes, my father has green eyes, most Jewish people I know have brown eyes. He had blue eyes. I thought nobody's going to believe me if I say Jesus has blue eyes, but he has beautiful blue eyes. He's 5'10"ish, maybe somewhere between 5'9" and 5'11", 160 pounds. He's slender. He was wearing kind of a white robe. Clothing wasn't important to me, so I noticed he was wearing white. It appeared to be a robe, but what I noticed were his hands, which were slender. His fingers were long and tapering. He had beautiful nails, and I noticed his feet. He's like me. He has long feet and long toes, long slender feet and long toes, which was really cool because I looked down at our feet when we were surfing. And the only thing I will say, which it may sound like an imperfection, but it wasn't. I really appreciated his nose because right here it was kind of crooked. And I thought, wow, he's got a crooked nose. That's so great. It gave his face so much character that it was just so, his face was the most real thing he was the most real person I've ever met in my life. It was the most real face I've ever looked at in my life. So that's what he looks like.
Well, that's probably the most detailed description I think we've ever gotten this far on the podcast.
Well, after we crossed this barrier and we approached this light, the only way I can describe this light is it was alive. How light can be alive. It was love. I describe it as a blemishless white light that was perfect. It took up my entire field of vision. Did not hurt my eyes. It did not burn me. And Jesus and I surfed, or we flew directly into the light. And I knew that light was love. I knew it was living, and I knew it was God. And Jesus took me straight to God, and I sat on his lap. And at that point in time, Jesus vanished. Well, he disappeared from my view, and he went into the light. He became part of the light. This is really hard to explain, and I can't explain it or describe it very well. But and I honestly couldn't see God's face. I was sitting. The next thing I knew, I found myself sitting on God's lap with my face buried in his chest and my arms around him. His arms were around me. I was kicking my feet like a little kid, and I never wanted to move. Now, did I look up at his face? No, I did not. And I don't know if I would have seen it if I had. I I don't know. It was as if it was shrouded in clouds. I did not see his face. But here I am sitting on God's lap. And it was the most marvelous experience. It's beyond words. I felt loved. I felt that I belonged. I felt that I was home. I never wanted to leave him. I would have sat there for all eternity with my face buried in his chest, and I would never have moved. I realized when I was sitting on his lap and God and I didn't speak, I just knew he was love. I knew that how a light can be a man and a light at the same time, I don't know. How something can be living love, the living embodiment of love, I don't know. I have no clue. But he was. And as I sat there, and I did not want to lift my head, believe me, I just wanted to sit there. This infinite living God it was this, I'm going to describe it this way. I can't, this is the only analogy I can come up with. He kind of moved, shifted so that I had to lift my head. And I saw that he pulled away a corner of himself, infinitely far away. He withdrew a corner of himself, like as if he was withdrawing an infinite size robe. And when he withdrew that corner of himself, I could see what I can only describe as heaven. And the first thing I saw, which has, well, I hope I never forget, was grass. It was this amazing green grass. And remember, this was infinitely far away. And I could see every blade of every grass, every blade of grass, every single individual blade of grass. And it was a brilliant green. The colors were beyond what we have here. What the colors here on the most beautiful day are a shadow. They're just a reflection of what is in heaven. And then I could see flowers, and I could see every petal of every flower, and every vein in every petal of every flower, and every, what is the pistil and stamen of every flower, and every grain of pollen. I could see trees. I could see every leaf on every tree, every individual leaf, every vein in every leaf. And they were all moving, but there was no wind, but they were moving with the light, and they were singing the praises of God. The grass was singing. That was the thing that just awed me, was the grass. Every blade of grass was singing the praises of God. And I couldn't look away. And then I saw, as I looked farther, there was sort of a meadow, but I could see a pathway, and that was misty. That was kind of shrouded in clouds as well. There was as if there was a veil between that, what was coming down the pathway, and myself. I could see people were coming. I could hear singing, but I couldn't make anything out clearly. But I just saw people were coming towards me on that pathway. And remember, this was all infinitely far away. This was not right up close and right in front of my face. This was really far away, but I could see every detail. And it was at that moment, as I was staring at this, that Jesus came, and he said, stood right next to me, and he said, "You didn't die. You have to go back." And I buried my face back in God's chest. I said, "I'm not going back. I'm not going back." And he said, "You didn't die. You have to go back," in a very clear voice. His voice is clear as a bell. And I said, "No, I didn't. I'm not going back. I'm not going back." And he took my hand, and I was shrieking at him, "I'm not going back. I'm not going back. You can't make me go back." I was having this huge argument with him. And just as he pulled me off God's lap, I remember shrieking, "I'll feel pain." And the next thing I knew, there was no surfing, there was no tunnel, there was nothing. Bam, we were right above my body. And I didn't want to get in my body, and he shoved me in. I was basically kind of, call it hoovering. I was hoovered in, like vacuumed in my body from underneath, and hit my face. Think about being shoved into a box and hitting the inside of the box. I hit the inside of my skull, and I panicked. I had the worst panic attack you can imagine. I didn't know I was trapped in this body, and the next thing I knew, Jesus was in my body with me. And the only way to describe it is to say that he smoothed my arms into my arms, and he smoothed my legs into my legs, and he made me one person again. And he said one last thing before he left me, which was, your life is in good hands, which is something that haunted me for years. And it took me a while to remember to figure out how to open an eye, how to talk. And I was pretty badly injured, but I did eventually manage to crack open an eye, and I saw the ranch owner kneeling next to me crying, and I croaked out his name, and kind of the rest is history.
It sounds like you came back and you're still lying on the ground. What happens next?
I was kind of laying on my left side in a heap, and Charlie threw me over the horse, which is probably the last thing you want to do to someone who just died. But he threw me over the horse, went racing down to my car, threw me in the back of my car, drove right past the hospital, and took me home. And as I said, I have, my family's a little odd. So he carried me upstairs, laid me on my bed, and I couldn't move. I had no feeling from the waist down. I had a fractured pelvis, broken back, crushed chest, and multiple other injuries. And my parents left me there for 24 hours. My mother put a heating pad on my back, and since I couldn't feel it, I got a 3rd-degree burn and ended up with a bad decubitus ulcer. And when I still couldn't walk the next day, I had to haul myself on my arms down to the car, get to a clinic, and he sent me straight to the hospital and it was not the best situation. It wasn't a trauma center. There weren't any neurosurgeons or neurologists there. And I kind of laid on my back for a month. It was a really difficult recovery. And the miracle is that I recovered. I made a full recovery without much intervention, no therapy. My back, the vertebrae in my lower back fused themselves. I didn't have anything done. I didn't have surgery, and which was it was truly a miracle. When I came back, stopped doing drugs, no smoking, broke up with the kids I was hanging out with. Jesus didn't tell me to do that. I just did that. And I kept my head down, stopped rebelling, graduated from school a year early, and went to Israel. Because if there was one thing I knew, it was that I needed to go to Israel so I could walk where Jesus had walked. I had to be there. And I was Jewish anyway. I wanted to go to Israel anyway. But I stayed in a kibbutz in the Galilee and learned Hebrew. Went everywhere he might have gone, stayed in the Garden of Gethsemane overnight. I just had to do it. I had to walk where he had walked.
And how did that impact you? And did you keep it a secret, the story from your family? Did you share? And what was their response? And how did that influence your relationship with them?
Well, my father, I still have a relationship with them. It's dysfunctional for other reasons, but I did tell my parents that I had died and met Jesus. I died, met Jesus, and gone to heaven. When I was in the hospital, I told them the second day I was hospitalized when they came to visit me. My father went deadly silent, got pale. My mother just said, "Oh, don't be silly." But they called in a psychiatrist, and they called in a rabbi who, at that time, our Orthodox synagogue had closed, and we belonged to a Reform temple in Omaha. They called in a rabbi who was an atheist. He was a secular humanist to counsel me. And the psychiatrist didn't talk much about this. He just talked around it. He listened to me, but he didn't say anything, which was probably a good thing. The rabbi just said, "Oh, we imagine a lot of things when we're unconscious." Well, I wasn't. And I said, I wasn't unconscious. I was dead. And after that, I didn't talk about it. My father has, in fact, never read my hospice book because he doesn't want to deal with death and dying. And he certainly doesn't want to deal with the fact that I died and met Jesus. So we don't talk about it. My sisters and I have talked about it, especially my little sister. She was very impacted by this accident. So I can talk to her about it. And I didn't really talk about it at all. My kids are aware of the story, but it wasn't until I heard John Burke interviewed a number of years ago that I contacted him, and then I was able to talk about it. I can't talk about it with Jewish people because Jesus is kind of a bad word, and I'm Jewish, and my kids are Jewish. I'm married to a Jewish man, but it's kind of hard to talk to. It was hard for me to talk to open up to Christians as well, because I just didn't want to be. I just felt like, who's going to believe me? I know the experience was true, the most true thing that's ever happened to me, the most real thing. It's real. That's the only way I can describe it, is it's real. And I just decided I'm not going to talk about it. So it took me a lot of years to go public with this. It's difficult to be a Jewish person who met Jesus and accepts Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. It's really hard. You don't really fit into the Jewish community anymore. As you said, Randy, you kind of are declared dead, either dead or an idiot. So, and I'm not a Jew for Jesus. I'm not going to be at an airport telling people to believe in Jesus. I didn't. That's not my thing. So.